Hello and welcome to Tuesday in Parliament, our look at the best of the day in the Commons and the Lords. On this programme, expansion of Heathrow Airport is given the go-ahead by the Transport Secretary. Reaction is decidedly mixed.
Heathrow expansion is neither possible nor deliverable.
It delivers the greatest economic and strategic benefits to our economy.
I congratulate my right honourable friend in taking the right decision in the interests of the United Kingdom.
The government should not be in the business of encouraging people to fly.
MPs delve into so-called revolving door syndrome, when an ex-minister gets a job in business after politics.
Can you tell me what you've done over your 2 years in office that gives you satisfaction, where you've served the public interest?
I take pleasure in every day, Mr. Flynn, as I'm sure members of my committee do.
And the Chancellor sounds a warning on Brexit.
European politicians are very conscious of the impact of Britain's departure on their political project.
But first, the waiting is over. Or is it? The government has given its blessing to an expansion of London's Heathrow Airport. The decision has been long awaited, but it may not be final. Parliament will vote in a year's time on the third runway plan. There could still then be years of legal argument. Heathrow, Britain's only hub airport, is currently at 98% capacity, handling 480,000 flights a year. That compares with 700,000 flights a year at Amsterdam, Paris and Frankfurt airports. A third runway at Heathrow will cost around £17 billion. Construction over the next decade could create 77,000 jobs. In the Commons, the Transport Secretary said the decision to go ahead with Heathrow expansion safeguarded the UK's prosperity. Last year, Britain's airports handled a total of 250 million passengers.
Heathrow is the busiest two-runway airport in the world, and Gatwick the busiest single-runway airport. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the London system will be almost entirely full by 2030, with the exception of a small amount of capacity at Luton, and that will be taken up soon afterwards. If we do nothing, the cost to our nation is significant, amounting to more than £20 billion over 60 years through delays, fewer flights and passengers having to fly from airports elsewhere. In addition, the wider impacts on our economy are in the region of £30 to £45 billion. That is why the decision we've reached today is so important to the future of our country.
He said the detailed study of the airport's commission, led by the economist Howard Davis, recommended a new northwest runway at Heathrow.
The Commission's report and that subsequent information formed the basis of the discussion that took place this morning at the Cabinet Subcommittee. As a result of that discussion, Mr. Speaker, the Government has decided to accept that recommendation. We believe that the expansion of Heathrow Airport and the North-West Runway scheme, in combination with a significant package of supporting measures on the scale recommended by the Airports Commission, offers the greatest level of benefit to passengers, business and to help us deliver the broadest possible benefit to the whole of the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, it delivers the greatest economic and strategic benefits to our economy. It strengthens connectivity for passengers right across the United Kingdom. It offers a major boost to freight operators. It can be delivered within carbon and air quality limits. And crucially, it comes with world-leading measures to limit the impacts on those living nearby. There have been suggestions in the media recently that this process has been slowed down or somehow delayed. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the opposite is not the case. Members will remember the saga of the planning process behind Terminal 5, which took years to resolve.
He said a consultation process will start in the new year.
Mr. Speaker, the issue of runway capacity in the South East is one that has challenged successive administrations for decades. There are strong feelings both for and against a third runway at Heathrow. This is not, Mr. Speaker, the scheme that was previously promoted in 2009. It does much more to mitigate environmental impacts. It does much more to compensate communities. It does much more to distribute benefits across the nation.
The announcement today isn't the end of the process, it's merely the start. And it beggars belief that it's taken ministers over a year since the publication of the Davies report to even make that start. Just what have they been doing for all these months, apart from worrying about splits in the Cabinet and the Foreign Secretary throwing himself in front of the bulldozers and former mayoral candidates triggering by-elections? There is no justification for dithering on this scale, and he's failed to reconcile the shorter timescale to get to the national policy statement as per the timetable set out by the Transport Select Committee.
The lack of a vote in this House for over a year will not allow people and companies a true end, and therefore the soap opera will continue. But that said, we welcome this announcement of Heathrow as a preference. Thank you. Airport expansion of this type is a development, though, that disproportionately benefits the South East and England, but has strategic consequences for Scottish air routes.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my right honourable friend in taking the right decision in the interests of the United Kingdom. Could you remind the House how much passenger traffic, and particularly how much freight traffic, is currently being lost to mainland European airports as a result of lack of capacity in the South East?
I believe this decision is misguided and not ultimately in the nation's interests. Will the Secretary of State assure me, in the consultation scrutiny to come, there will be good and adequate scientific data, because the evidence will show Heathrow expansion is neither possible nor deliverable, in the Minister's words, not expansion at any cost. This is the wrong scheme and the price is too high.
The decision to build a new runway at Heathrow is, I believe, the right one, but it's absolutely vital he delivers on his pledge to ensure that the benefits of expansion are felt in every nation and region of the UK.
As Chair of the Gatwick Coordination Group, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on this announcement and make clear to him the relief with which this will be received, this somewhat overdue statement by all the people represented by colleagues in the Gatwick Coordination Group.
Zach Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has chosen a course that is not only wrong, it's doomed. It's wrong because of the million people who will directly suffer on the back of the environmental harm this project unavoidably produces, and doomed because the complexities, the costs, the legal complications mean that this project is almost certainly not going to be delivered. I believe this will be a millstone around this government's neck for many, many years to come. Constant source of delay, constant source of anger and betrayal.
Isn't the biggest loser from the Tory civil war over Heathrow not the Foreign Secretary nor the member for Richmond Park, but transport everywhere else? Because for over 5 years there's been an obsessive focus on London and the South East. So while welcoming this decision, can I ask the Home Counties-based Cabinet to listen to what William Hague has said today and set out in the autumn statement a clear timetable for HS3 linking Manchester Airport to the great cities of the north?
This is a devastating decision, I think, for the national economic interest, as well as for my constituents, hundreds of whose homes would be bulldozed, and for the millions of people affected by the very loud noise from Heathrow Airport.
This statement has been long overdue. I think some countries will have developed 3 entire nuclear power stations and 5 airports. The amount this has been taken to be kicked in the long grass by 2 Labour Prime Ministers, and I'm afraid a Conservative Prime Minister too.
I don't share this cosy consensus on airport expansion. Half the population each year doesn't fly for environmental reasons. I haven't flown for several years. The Secretary of State today says this expansion will, quote, further reduce carbon emissions, unquote. What a joke. Because of climate change, the government should not be in the business of encouraging people to fly and more air freight, let alone subsidising increased airport capacity and higher total emissions. I urge the Secretary of State and the government to think again.
Why is the government disregarding widespread hostility and bulldozing through a 3rd runway, which will inflict crippling noise, significant climate change effects, health-damaging air pollution and catastrophic congestion on 1 million Londoners?
Because we don't believe it's going to do those things, because we don't believe it's going to create the air pollution he talks about, because we don't believe it's going to impose catastrophic congestion. Indeed, I've explained the position as regards public transport access, improved infrastructure around the airport.
Chris Grayling. And there was also plenty of reaction to the Heathrow expansion announcement over in the House of Lords.
Many young people at the job centres in West London know how important that skilled employment is at Heathrow. So I do say, let's get on with this and make a plea to those people who are opposed to it to look at the depth and quality of the evidence in favour from business, from trade unions, all the trade unions bar one, all of them, and say that this project needs to go ahead.
So with all of business crying out for this to happen, and yet all this opposition, there's going to be a lot of resistance to this. Why didn't the government then go ahead, as my noble friend said earlier, and allow Gatwick and Heathrow to expand? Because the Gatwick expansion, wouldn't noble Lord the Minister agree, could go ahead straight away.
Will my noble friend consider that expanding Heathrow will increase foreign monopoly-owned power and weaken airport competition in the London area? It will affect hundreds of thousands more people than Gatwick would have. It will add to safety and security risk by sending hundreds of thousands more flights over our most densely populated areas. It will cost £8,000 million at least, more than the proposed Gatwick option, and it will take longer to build than the proposed Gatwick option, keeping Britain closed for business longer.
I must declare an interest as living under the flight path and as president of HACAN, the Heathrow Association for the Control of Aircraft Noise. The announcement acknowledges that the current constraints don't fully work for residents by talking about more reliable respite, and the Minister will be aware that the measurements of noise do not accord with residents' experience. I'm sure he will also agree that the best predictor of the future is past experience.
The debate over Heathrow expansion. A bill designed to help clamp down on money laundering and prevent the financing of terrorist activity has been given the initial approval of MPs. The Criminal Finances Bill is also aimed at increasing the retrieval rate of proceeds of crime. It creates so-called unexplained wealth orders, which may require an individual to explain the sources of his or her wealth. The Commons has held its first debate on the bill's general principles.
Some of the most expensive properties in the capital are unoccupied because they have been bought solely for the purpose of laundering dirty money. So in 2016, money laundering is something that is not just happening in accountancy offices or in the back rooms of banks. It is happening in the plain sight of ordinary Londoners, because we see some of the most expensive domestic properties in the world change hands, but remain mysteriously and persistently empty.
We should be rightly proud of the UK's status as a global financial centre. This is one of the best places, I'll just progress, the right honourable lady, this is one of the best places in the world to do business, but we must recognise that the size of our financial sector and open economy and the attractiveness of London property market to overseas investors makes this country unusually exposed to the risks of international money laundering. That is why the government is taking action to combat money laundering, terrorist finance and corruption here and overseas. We are sending a clear message that we will not stand for money laundering or the funding of terrorism through the UK.
After the global financial crisis, property in London has become one of the safest investments in the world, and one which rich criminals and money launderers are attracted to in just the same way as people who have made their money legitimately. And put shortly, Londoners want this stain removing from their city, and this bill will help do that tonight.
We will not trigger a division on this bill this evening, but we want to reiterate very, very firmly that this bill does not go anywhere near far enough in dealing with what I think is a real intangible outcry from the public, given what has happened over the last 5, 6, 7 years. And if we are serious about maintaining and creating confidence in the banking system again, which is completely evaporated, then we need to tackle this issue head on and do more than we're doing in this bill.
You're watching our roundup of the day in the Commons and the Lords. Still to come, are too many ex-government ministers taking up jobs in the business world secured because of their days in the ministerial ranks? The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has warned MPs not to assume that the negotiations on the UK's exit from the European Union would only be determined by economics. Britain's departure, he said, would impact on the EU's political project. He also gave a warning that leaving the European single market for goods and services, the so-called hard Brexit option, could be quite challenging for British firms. The subject was raised by the SNP's spokesman.
What efforts is the Chancellor making to rule out a hard Brexit with visas, tariff barriers, an end to the customs union, all of which the Treasury themselves say it could lead to the loss of £66 billion of revenue, a reduction in GDP of around 7.5%, and a threat, estimated conservatively, to 500,000 jobs?
The Prime Minister has been very clear. We understand the instructions that we've received from the British people, and within our obligation to deliver those, we will seek to get the very best deal we can with the European Union that maximises the amount of trade in goods and services between our companies and the markets of the European Union, and European companies and the UK market.
Financial services are one of the sectors most exposed to Brexit. But it's not just jobs in Canary Wharf and the Square Mile that are at risk. It's jobs throughout the UK, in Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, Edinburgh and beyond. The messages the government have sent so far have been incoherent and counterproductive. Firms need assurance they will get comparable access to the single market and the ability to retain EU nationals who currently work for them. Will the Chancellor help to finally put an end to his government's chaos today and make a promise to deliver both?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is right to identify financial services as one of the areas that is particularly concerned about the way in which the exit from the European Union is managed, because the industry is particularly dependent upon the passporting regime that is in place. And he's also right to draw attention to the often overlooked fact that 75% of financial services jobs are outside London. This is an important UK-wide industry.
Financial services, he said, would be at the heart of the negotiations.
We understand their needs for market access. We also understand their needs to be able to engage the right skilled people. And I have said on the record, and I'm happy to say again today, that I do not believe that the concerns that the British people have expressed about migration from the European Union relate to people with high skills and high pay. The problem that people are concerned about is people taking entry-level jobs, and I see no likelihood that we will use powers to control migration into the UK to prevent companies bringing highly skilled, highly paid workers here.
Unless, bizarrely, the European Union are going to impose trade sanctions on the UK, there will be absolutely nothing to stop us having access to the single market when we leave.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right in the sense that every nation that's a member of the WTO, and we are a member of the WTO, has the right to access other members' markets on WTO terms. But WTO terms will be quite challenging for some of our industries. For example, in the automotive industry, WTO terms imply a 10% tariff on cars entering other markets.
Could I suggest to him that, as there's not only a very large balance of payments deficit with Europe, but specifically a large one on automotive, it is in the EU's interests to strike a decent deal with us, as he intends to do?
Mr. Speaker, our intention is to get the very best deal that we can with our neighbours in the European Union to allow access for our companies to trade their goods and services into the European Union. But I would just caution him that looking at the economic arguments alone is to miss a very important point. There is a political debate going on here in Europe, where European politicians are very conscious of the impact of Britain's departure on their political project. And I don't think we can be certain that economics alone will dictate the course of this negotiation.
Philip Hammond. A year ago, it was learnt that more than a dozen politicians who were ministers during the years of the Con-Lib Dem coalition government had accepted positions with companies and charities that they'd come across in their ministerial roles. The disclosure led to calls for tighter controls on what's known as the revolving door between politics and the business world, by which ex-ministers are able to gain employment thanks to contacts they've made during their ministerial years. Already in place is a body called ACABA, or the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. But when its chairman came along to a Commons committee hearing, MPs questioned whether ACABA was achieving very much at all.
We've referred to private eye before, and I'm sure you're familiar now with the evidence session that we had here. And in their report, Public Servants and Private Paydays, they actually said 367 jobs for which former mandarins have sought clearance from Aqaba since 2010. 0 times Aqaba has refused them. I mean, given that as a prima facie evidence of your organisation, how good are you actually in policing?
We're not a regulatory body, we're an advisory body. I really have to emphasise two things. We are an advisory body, we are not a regulatory body, we do not have the power to deprive people of their employment. That is also backed up by the restraint of trade law that we have to bear in mind. If you're asking me, why don't we just, let these things run their course and go to court, as it almost certainly they would, I suspect applicants would certainly have, and I think there is some indication from 1 or 2 cases we've dealt with, would have the backing financially of the people who wanted to employ them to mount a legal challenge.
How many times have you advised, say, former ministers that what they were proposing to accept in terms of a job was unacceptable? And where would the public find that information?
Well, everything is in the public domain. In fact, most of the things you read in the press are only there because Aqaba has a website on which we publish every case that is taken up. So, it couldn't be more transparent that we do that. But when you say ministers, we obviously apply different rules in individual cases. So we might say to one minister, well, we think you should wait for 6 months. Or in another case, we should say you should have nothing to do with that contract for 2 years. We've applied those sorts of that sort of advice. That is the way in which we can get them to modify any potential behaviour that they might have had in taking up the post. But we haven't got the power to tell somebody they cannot work. They could just shrug their shoulders and say, well, okay. But in the main, people come to Aqaba and they take our advice.
Isn't it true that the ultimate power you have is to send a letter to people who've ignored you altogether and haven't bothered applying or come back retrospectively? The summit of your powers is to send a letter to them expressing your displeasure.
We are an advisory committee, we're not a regulatory committee. Exactly. I really can't repeat that enough. We are an advisory committee.
Well, I know, I'm well aware of that, but could you tell me what you've done over your 2 years in office that gives you satisfaction, where you've served the public interest?
I take pleasure in every day, Mr. Flynn, as I'm sure members of my committee do. We work hard, we work diligently, we work ethically.
Please, look, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but you really, I want to try to get to the nub of this. Is Aqaba doing anything good? You've said you've made a lot of defences about Aqaba and the people there and now their rights of work and so on. But the public good, how is the public interest being served by Aqaba in preventing the abuse of the revolving door?
We have considered each individual case, and those that take up the advice and who take up the job, we have put that into the public domain. Had we not done that, if we didn't do that as Aqaba, these things would be a secret. They would be down to investigative journalists to unearth them and put them into the public domain. Investigative journalists don't need to do that. They only have to visit our website.
Lady Browning. Earlier this month, Sir Cliff Richard came to Parliament to ask MPs and peers to grant anonymity to people accused of sex crimes. The singer says he fears that he will be forever tainted by false allegations made against him 2 years ago. In June, the Crown Prosecution Service announced it would bring no charges after a lengthy police inquiry. In the House of Lords, a senior Conservative voiced concerns about the ease with which the reputations of eminent people could be tarnished.
Is the presumption of innocence until proved guilty still in existence? Isn't it our duty to take action either by instituting anonymity to the point of charges backed by the Director of Public Prosecutions last week, or by other effective means in order to reduce the terrible toll of suffering caused by false and malicious allegations against innocent people in all walks of life? And finally, my Lords, would the Government agree that institutions of both state and church need to show much greater concern for the reputations of eminent people in the past who cannot speak for themselves.
What I will say to Noble Lords, I think it's so important to say, is that we've got a very fine balance to be struck, and it is a very difficult balance to be struck on victims' concerns that are coming forward, names that might come forward in the public interest, to allow further evidence to come forward or to allow further victims to come forward, need to be balanced with that right to privacy and that protection of the person being suspected.
Lady Williams. And that's it for this programme. Do join me for our next Daily Roundup. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.